Amazing. I think we have like a pretty full room, like well in advance of everything kicking off. So I might as well just say a few introductory words. This has been a slightly different way of going about things, and the one sadness is that you couldn't be in the room this morning. The conversation between the tutors and the level of passion and generosity with tutors advocating for students that they don't know, that they have no vested interest in, was truly extraordinary. It gave us the capacity to really talk between ourselves about the incredible work that has been completed this year. By the end of the morning, I think I was almost quite emotional with the level of passion that was exhibited by the tutors. It's quite rare that as a group we can get together and actually engage with and appreciate each other's work that may be pursuing an entirely different approach, methodology, agenda, and to really celebrate the level, the depth, the curiosity, the passion, and really the delight that has been demonstrated in the work we see this afternoon. So the work you see this afternoon is, I think, truly exceptional. And it's been a truly exceptional year. For me, obviously, I started with the diploma students at the same time, and I've got to know many of you in the corridors, the terrace, and the bar, or your juries, or your tables. And so, in many ways, I feel very attached to these moments. So it's a wonderful way of celebrating some really, really fantastic pieces of work, again, across a huge spectrum of interests. I think all of them demonstrate not only a degree of skill, but so many layers of complexity and depth, and a way of embracing some of the absolutely most urgent things that we are confronting, not just as architects, but as sort of members of society. I think that this then comes forward in ways that speak to individual levels of invention, of intuition, and of integrity. And I think hopefully you'll enjoy what you have to see this afternoon, and we can all celebrate together. So, over to you. You can use either of this.
I'll preface this.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Won Ho from Diploma 3, and this is a Reading Thermal Soundscape, proposing a urban living rooms utilizing funnels, double curvature, and apertures, and they will set a new condition for people's daily lives in Kuala Lumpur City Centre in Malaysia, encouraging interaction towards the activated urban natures. And the funneling urban living rooms are articulated. Yeah, on that side of the drawing, the funneling urban living rooms will be articulated with the consideration of these consistent design languages that have been explored through these earlier iterations below. And they are modulated through the formal design's character of funneling, curvatures, and apertures. And in overview, while the spatial experiences are simultaneously explored through the physically constructing the models. So the excessive heat and noise negatively impact urban living standards, and 65% of European urban dwellers experience distress due to urban noise, and over 500 million are affected by the heat waves. The concentration of vehicles, devices, and the tall, narrow surface with the dense urban environment intensify the perceived noise and heat. Therefore, the uninhabitable islands for both human and non-human are formed. The indoor-oriented anthropogenic infrastructure with air-conditioned commercial podium interiors resulting in a missing out opportunity to improve the well-being by not interacting with the nature. So therefore, the intensified noise and heat topography, over-reliance of indoor space, and the verticality of the site shows a clear sense of disconnection of the ground level. The spatial hierarchy does not allow the communities to come together. So the urban living room that I'm proposing is therefore to serve as a key function to blend the outdoor and indoor environments. To implement this in the urban island, the proposal responds with the expansion and compression of threshold and the scale of curvature to create thermoacoustics. And apertures provoke the varying engagement towards different urban conditions. So in this first iteration, the single curvilinear surface building in a building scale highlights the continuation of the streetscape into the exterior. The slit of openings towards the outside provide extensive and strong relationship with the ground level while minimizing the outdoor sound by reflecting the steep slope. The integration of multiple slopes provoke the spatial smoothness, creating a sense of unity. In this further developed volumetric design, the structure follows the hyperbolic funnels, dividing the overall geometry in multiple panels. The division can manipulate the perception of scale and proportion, making the space feel larger or even more intimate. The room scale funnel offers a low aperture, making outdoor space feel more accessible, while the tall aperture promotes openness and framing the outdoor visual vistas. The further defined double curvilinear surface create the overhangs placed on the level of the vantage points to create the visual thresholds defined by the smooth curvature, directing the view towards the urban nature. The inverted aperture on the model between each overhangs interact across the level, having the visual penetration through the collective spaces. The undulating space provides semi-opened volume underneath for the large-scale gatherings, and the occupation along the angle, establishing outdoor public space. Moving on to the site context, the existing types of urban living room and activities at the KLCC Malaysia at the moment can be categorized into a gradient of acoustic and thermal ranges. And these provide the opportunities for spatial creation enabled by the proposed funneling characteristics. The extending cultural and social activities and establishing a new connection between urban nature and human settlements that offers beyond interior shopping mall typology. The multi-ethnic demographics bring diverse and endless celebrations into KLCC. Urban soundscape could bring collectivity of a range of ethnic and age groups altogether. To achieve this spatial smoothness and a double curvilinear surface, the adjustable fixtures modulate the fabric formwork to achieve the various scale of panels, and also able to control the ripples of the fabric surface for the interior that can be diffuse and amplify the sound, and facilitating the airflow pattern. And the fabric surface enhances the spatial smoothness and filters the negatively perceiving soundscape, showing the seamless connectivity through the network of space to bring people in and out, while the concrete surface exterior diffuse and reflect the noise. Therefore, the stretched fabric and apertures integrate the compression and expansion of points of the funneling, softer rather than having a strict threshold between the space, emphasizing the continuity of social and physical movements. Considering the aim of extending the expansive urban vista and connecting elevated funnels with surrounding pocket spaces as identified in KLCC, the funneling geometry continues to develop into corporate apertures at the front and the rear side of the construction. When the funnel faces an anthropogenic noise, such as heavy, intensive traffic noise, the diminishing funnel can be used with the geometry can reduce the unwanted noise. And this creates a spatial experience of acoustic compression, associating noisy area with compressed spaces. And in contrast, the gathering space with the ambient light channeled from the vertical funnel and amplified, the nature sounds are expressed as an expansive space. And these areas have a wider apertures to invite the vibrant natural soundscape overlooking towards the existing green covers. So as a key design principle, this demands the curvilinear surface with hyperbolic geometry to enhance the flow and acoustic modulation through the funneling, aperture, and curvatures. To provide a visual, acoustic, and thermal vista on the consideration of the socio-cultural context of KLCC. This articulates the scale of the funnels, overhang and slope, undulation of the panels will accommodate the terrace and the volume with varying urban living rooms to different activities and size of groups. So this, the final proposal of prototypical alternative podium offers escape from the noise and heat from the city by providing funneling geometries to establish urban living rooms in form of continuous terrace, rooftop, and slope through its aperture, angle, and scale. So the density and the echoing chamber, and it's on the ground level, the room scale panel with the gentle slope invite working group of the KLCC over the breakout and recreational period in their daily life into this central echoing chamber with building scale panels implemented indoor along its spatial expansion, offering tranquil atmosphere with the funneling passage with the denser panels diffuse and subdue the negatively perceived sound, allowing users to acoustically engage into the city, into the interior. And the seamless flow of the interior panel made of the fabric will make the space feel more cooler by its visual permeability. And also for the volume of the space located along the vertical funnel, they will transmit the sound to fill the echoing chamber with the vibrant soundscapes. And the sound transmitted through the outdoor aperture will mask the excessive noise, promoting the outdoor interactions. So the festivals will be navigated and extended through the funneling tunnel into the central chamber, connecting the segregated urban fabric, amplifying the cultural soundscape into its neighborhoods. The pocket spaces adjacent towards the busy street will accommodate the active and the loud function as a party room to hold a big social events, taking the entire cluster as a collective network through the funnels and the apertures. And lower and longer overhanging roofscapes are orienting towards the existing green space or towards the right, allowing the users to directly interact to the urban nature acoustically and visually. So in summary, the thermal soundscape embraces the socio-cultural context of the KLCC and connects segregated urban fabrics together to activate public and green spaces, taking people out of the interior into the dynamic and vibrant soundscape. This, by making the funnel urban living rooms inhabitable, it brings vibrancy from its ever-changing occupancy and nature. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have Gal, no? I have to say, as you do your switchover, there's just some really wonderful comments about the level of kind of rigor when it comes to the technical side of your development, but also there's a real craft in the way in which you work through models. So there's something that works not just with data, but has a real character of space. And if you get a chance just to look at the physical work over here, is extraordinary at every scale. So it was a beautiful thing to see. So thank you so much. Congratulations.
In that story, the sad story of the Great Lakes, it all starts from an architectural device, from the ditch. Reading this element, considered as historical marker for very early settlements, transitioned into the worst enemy of wetlands, its underground and overground land patterns indicating toxicity and nutrient overfeeding. I would suggest bringing its opposition, the anti-ditch. Immortality is humanity's next challenge, as suggested by Yuval Noah Harari in his book Homo Deus. Longevity and divinity will bring happiness. Scientists believe that amelioration would bring utility and productivity, but it brought eugenics and racism. This pursuit for divine powers is expressed in that image over there, replacing God's hand, showing Adam's hand trying to reach an IVF needle. And this needle penetrates the human body the same way that the subsurface ditch penetrates the soil, spreading toxicity all over the Midwestern American landscape, detached from Earth system. Instead, I would suggest reconciliation, or as Bruno Latour said, stop sterilization. Corn Belt, manufacturing belt, steel belt, rust belt, no longer the American dream, rather a system at its collapse. For decades, this is the poor image of the Great Lakes, supposed to be the resource for clean drinking water of 20% of world's population. But not just that. It is also a massive carbon sink, responsible for storing more than 1.7 gigatons of carbon, covering over 2 million hectares. But these two roles are continuously disrupted, like a long chain of close encounters. It is framed as a wicked problem, that its source is a scientific uncertainty, lack of data. But this is not the reason why we cannot understand the behavior of this wide-hand entity. Binational agreements have been made since the 70s. The most funded institutions are trying to manage the nutrient flux. The Clean Water Act is changing its version since Nixon's version in 1972. While in fact, no more data is needed. We should reframe the wicked problem. One should depict the Great Lakes landscape as a vast, flat expanse of tidy fields and modest farmhouses, crossed with county roads. But it wasn't always this way. Back in the late 1800s, this part of the Midwest was a wild expanse of wet forest and marsh, stretching across millions of acres. Native populations just left it alone, named it Olentangy, meaning river of the red face paint, for the clay found in the region. Colonial settlers who slogged through the muck and mosquitoes used to call it the Great Black Swamp. But settlers came anyway, felling the giant sycamores and oaks to create roads and digging miles of drainage trenches to slowly bleed the water away from the muck. But they wanted it faster and bigger. The soil was still too wet to grow their crops and feed their animals. So they added underground tubes with holes on the top. Blood, sweat, and tears have created today's Great Lakes' worst enemy, the subsurface ditch. But it is surely worthwhile when you have the most productive farmland in the nation. These people did so great that they have passed down a deep loathing of wetlands. The same as the relationship of avoidance with microbes, wetlands are considered as a threat, as a thing to overcome. These attitudes are enshrined in state law, which make it almost impossible to act. It's not only these underground systems. Small herds on huge swaths of land have become the inverted version of itself. Thousands of cows sharing now a very small space. The Midwestern American call it the CAFO, Centralized Animal Feeding Operations. And these tiles, clay in the past, plastic today, function as toxic underground streams. This image of the CAFO, the cornfield, the lagoon manure, and the silo is almost freezed, cannot be touched or modified. These liquids join the nearest stream, feeding water bodies and creating the ideal home for massive algae blooms, depleting water from oxygen, choking marine lives. Symptoms, markers, indicators are ignored, while cement and steel are immortalized. But let us not forget Louis Pasteur's contagious ferment in relation to microbes and sterilized relationships. This is the entity that we cannot control or govern, and mostly cannot be restored. We shouldn't avoid Pasteur's contagious ferment. It should be embraced. The anti-ditch approach would suggest the enhancement of wetlands and the natural processes that it carries. It would suggest their reappearance, muddy and dirty, fermented. They will enhance multiple natural processes regulated by microbial activity, such as denitrification. Adopting Pasteur and Ruskin's ideas for the European 19th century transition and translating them into the 21st century American energy transition, I would call for the Midwestern American farmer to adopt the anti-ditch approach with the conversion of proliferated parts of agricultural lands into the fermented wetlands. Once adopted, the farmer is rewarded with credits, gaining the ability to sell them instead of simply exchanging nutrient caps, moving the dirt under the carpet. In this economic alternative, the farmer would no longer operate as an individual that owns a sole patch of land. Rather, he is being part of a well-negotiated system, operates under subsidy structures associated with preservation institutions and belong to a larger organizational structure. The anti-dish suggests that new parameters should be put in place. The anti-dish suggests that new parameters should be put in place. Organic matter, pH, suspended sediments, and turbidity, which I found the most indicative, would be part of this image, part of this highly sensitive multi-sensor device over there, that would be positioned for reevaluation and foremaking. Soon these devices become fermented as well. The immortalized concrete and steel monuments are now abandoned ruins, standing still for a nostalgic reminder for better days, for the American productive industrialized dream. But these monuments, as they are stuck, capturing a national memory, and its future is blurred and vague. For the question about everlasting memories that these monuments are supposed to restore and their authenticity, John Ruskin would have said that this is as impossible as to raise the dead. The glory days of these monuments are gone, and we should create new relationship with them. So humanity is aspiring for immortality by all means, but as it is impossible and dangerous for it to try to reach divinity of the human body, as history tells us, it is also a great risk for us to think that buildings are merely inert objects, that time has no effect on them. There is no entity that is free from these other elements, and as Pasteur called them in the context of aseptic life, a tertium quid, the agent that we cannot control. The future belt would no longer be the agglomerated, thriving manufacturing belt that defined by Krugman or the corroded industrial belt. It is not a primordial conifer forest as Lynn Margulis would have wanted it to be. The granary, the water tower, the silo are not monumental anymore and shouldn't be treated as such. Not anymore a symbol for power and yield, nor a desperate trial to freeze time. Instead, an anti-ditch approach would suggest to see them as possible moments of adaptive change that carries Ruskin's golden stains of time. They are now beacons, telling every American that crosses the road that a transition is going on. You can see them from afar. They imply for the new image of the American landscape, changing biologically, aesthetically, economically, structurally. And so the anti-ditch envisioning the integration of economic alternative and a preservation approach. It is an assemblage, a continuous maintenance of different elements from different fields of knowledge that are composed for the American agricultural landscape to its authenticity, unhygienic, unsterilized, fermented.
Thank you so much. It's like super fantastic presentation. I think the conversation that went on, obviously at your panel, but then obviously with the panel advocating for it, was so fascinating because so much of this is about the unseen and the invisible, and a very, very sensitive way of making it visible, but also making so many layers of research, so many layers of investigation, and managing to somehow allow them to harmonize in a way that can support the project. I mean, it's a huge amount that sits behind this. That no one will ever necessarily see, but it's evident in the work, and it's a fantastic job. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Hello everyone. I'm Palm from Diploma 6. And the greatest museum no one can see is a rhizomatic trope on the network of art movement and its unstable shifting nodes. Art requires visibility to be what it is. And yet this visibility is precisely what is threatened by the efforts to preserve or privatize it. This presents a paradoxical situation in which art finds itself in a state of stasis, a perpetual transition between public and private, visible and invisible, known and unknown. Beyond visible networks of cultural movement, there is a slippage, a crack that allows for important works of art to disappear into the space of the unknown and never to be seen again. This is the emergence of the free port. What would a new paradigm of cultural space look like when hidden spaces and processes are revealed? How can a new mode of thought be devised without reversing back to binary oppositions? The project is composed of multiple plateaus, moments in which there's a possible reflection but quickly move into something else, evading capture or grounding of that very idea. To engage with it is to engage with multiplicities. Its desire is to present an impossible formula of Deleuze meets Boulez. That is to say, the implosion of forms and the consolidations of flows. It surfs on the waves of reality, as well as permeating shifts in the disciplinary project, blending fact with theory, the dark side of infrastructure with radical speculation. It can be understood through different lines of flight, from the public to the artist, to the engineer, to the architect, to the philosopher. Ultimately, it exists as the tension between all these facets and folds of reality and theory. OMA correlated the increase in size of museums against the increase in the Dow Jones Index. However, its inversion is also true. The formation of the free port resulted in a progressive disappearance of art from public eye. Flows of capital determines visibility of art. In this way, the hidden network of art movement could be understood through 10 types, from cultural institutions to private galleries to auction houses and to free ports. But disappearance of art can happen in many ways, from the archival of art by cultural institutions to heists to art being classified and lost within the system. With the creation of the free port, a new kind of disappearance occurs. Important works of art are being bought and transplanted there, never to be seen again. This transcript describes the movement of 3 important paintings that were sold in auction and disappeared. It tracks concealed spaces and processes, revealing complex associations between cultural institutions and the free port, while bringing visibility to other active nodes. Da Vinci's Salvator Mundi is the most expensive painting to be sold in an auction. In 2005, it was bought for $1,000 as a study. However, upon restoration and tests, it was authenticated as an original by the National Portrait Gallery and bought for $75 million by Yves Bouvet, a protagonist of the Freeport concept. The painting was then immediately sold to a Russian oligarch for double the price within the walls of the Freeport. Klimt's Water Serpent and Bacon's triptych of Lucian-Freud follows a similar path. Patterns begin to emerge when the trajectories of these paintings are drawn next to one another. They were all transplanted into the Freeport around the same time. In this way, the movement of art can be organized by these 2 drawings. If cultural institutions are white spaces and free ports are black, auction houses and art dealers act as a mediator between the 2. It is an exchange interface that pulls art from known visible networks to unknown invincible ones. The 10 types could then be reread not by program, but by the role it performs. Cultural institutions becomes a validator, the auction house an exchange, and the free port as a mystifier and concealer of art. But how much of cultural institutions is actually visible? Traditional museums have no more than 40% of its total area assigned to exhibition space, whereas a new type of museum, such as MVRDV's Depot, has 66%. On the other hand, the free port, acting as another kind of art attractor, has a much higher ratio, ranging from 75 to 90%. It is the world's most secretive art vault, a terminal impermanence where works can be stored without having to pay tax. There is no time limit, ownership does not have to be declared, and sales can happen inside without anyone knowing. This comparison is very provocative and shows the varying density of the 2 types of attractors. The Louvre has a collection of 380,000 pieces with a total floor area of 200,000 square meters, whereas the Geneva Free Port holds 1.2 million pieces with only 30,000 square meters. This, coupled with the fact that prominent museums only display 5% of its collection at any given time, creates a situation in which only a small fraction of art is physically accessible to the public. What is visible is only the tip of the cultural iceberg. A rogue sector, a luxurious no man's land, a legalized extra-legality, a cage without borders makes up the greatest museum no one can see. What form could a new model of culture take? How can the greatest museum no one can see be redefined? Before this can happen, existing institutional figures needs to be understood in relation to how they organize space, time, and meaning. Ideal form and stable order appear and disappear each time a new paradigm of the museum is created. Throughout history, cultural institutions have gone through various stages of transformation, from national museums fortifying the image of stability, order, and power, to modern museums which reconditions meaning through the free plan, to contemporary museums challenging and fragmenting the stability of the whole. Different formal diagrams are constructed to destabilize figures and reimagine ground conditions. The strategies of nesting, interiorizing, unfolding, and rotating presents a manifesto in which architecture can rupture stability and provide visibility. By unfolding figures, the ground conditions becomes a transition between architecture and the city, public and private. These spaces fall outside the traditional dialectics of figure ground. Unlike postmodernist ideas, they're not mediators, interstices, or even in-betweens. They're undefined, promiscuous, contingents, or leftovers. Zooming out, a chronogram was created, placing different cultural institutions within a wider disciplinary context. If the reduction of the plan into a taxonomy establishes the stability and disciplinarity of institutional figures, the section reads them against different ground conditions. The intention is not to recite history, but to perform a critical review in order to extract and recompose different architectural moments, thus questioning the stabilization of institutional figures. These three drawings begin to suggest alternative ways of negating, propositioning, and constructing a new disciplinary ground. However, it is not sufficient to only operate within the territory of figure ground. Nor can architecture be described only through movement, vectors, and networks. Both are necessary to push its boundaries, a juxtaposition of formal models and abstract diagrams, challenging the authority of one over the other. On the one hand, the project could be presented as a figurative field, from national museums, public and highly controlled, to public and uncontrolled museums, to private and controlled, and private and uncontrolled. On the other hand, this field could be represented as fluid nodes instead of as static figures, an anti-square flows to the rigidity of the figurative square. It is in the double articulation of both that the project tries to operate in. As much as the project searches for a new organization of the art network through disciplinary shifts and visibilities of space, it is also concerned with the representation of these ideas through the canon of the diagrammatic machine. These drawings flatten the organization and transfer of culture, forming the base in which convention of hierarchy, linearity, and structure can be challenged. The project refuses to be tied down to a single idea, a single proposal, or a single mode of representation. Instead, multiple trajectories are presented, each one unfolding on top of the other, a process of perpetual construction and erasure. The greatest museum no one can see collapses the boundaries of public and private, known and unknown, visible and invincible, stable and unstable. This diagram tries to draw out different scenarios in which this could unfold. In the first scenario, a cultural eye is provided inside the free port. Invincibility is a screen that works both ways. The screen is supposed to provide anonymity, but inevitably it draws attention to itself. The Luxembourg Freeport is investigated. Its perimeter can be drawn, but its interior is a well-kept secret. The plan is constructed through images, interviews, articles, and filling in the gaps through speculation. Visibility of an unknown space is revealed by opening it up. Security devices, thresholds, and systems are mapped out, a heist plan devised. The Luxembourg Freeport is broken into. Information about the location of art and its owner are made available. The invincible space speaks back to the space of culture. The second scenario exaggerates the paradox of known and unknown, visible and invisible, by proposing a third condition. The unity of the square is disrupted by dividing it into halves. A neutral zone is inserted underneath three cultural figures of Paris. It is a mediator between cultural institution and Freeport, a space of transition where figure dissolves into flow, space repackaged as code. It performs as both a stock exchange for art and a fully automated warehouse, a cross between No Stop City and Amazon fulfillment centers, a third space that relocates the archives of the Pompidou on site while at the same time operating as a semi-autonomous Freeport. If the first scenario provides visibility to an unknown space, and the second scenario plays on the paradoxical nature of cultural transfer, the third scenario turns the greatest museum no one can see into an entropic zone, reorganizing the relationships of different art nodes and proposing a new type of cultural space. The entropic zone challenges the quadrants of the unified square by carving out and erasing parts of it so that new lines of flight can be formed. Concealed spaces and processes that are revealed to be an essential part of the art network are drawn on the perimeter as an assemblage. In this way, the visibility of the art network is presented as fragmented, disjointed, and unstable. The entropic zone becomes a zone for permanent transit, breaking the time loop that cultural institutions create and ruptures the false unity of the unified ground. It functions as a dynamic non-entity that reroutes art from Freeport and allows for it to be visible while maintaining its own internal economy. It is a deterritorialized plane that forms new connections to contemporary museums, not only cultivating work, but also sending new ones out to the world. It attaches itself to the off-site storage and secured warehouses, the other 95% of culture that cannot be accessed. It collects waste, leftovers, remnants, supplements of the art world. The entropic zone is a depository, laboratory, quarry, salon, graveyard, garage, arsenal. It is iconoclastic and exposes art beyond its cultural values. But what would be the spatial quality of the entropic zone? How would the non-entity, the non-hierarchical, the deterritorialized plane be represented architecturally without reverting back to traditional conventions? Throughout the year, many schemes, fragments, and infrastructures would develop, aborted, rework, and erase. Perhaps this is the way the entropic zone operates, an expansive archive of provocations and moments buried in the sand, hidden away, waiting to be discovered, a partial reminder of spaces we don't seem to know. The impossibility of arriving at an image should not be seen as a failure, but as a hint to a possible reframing of culture, glimpses of a new system that implodes form, consolidates flow, and collides multiple plateaus of meanings, sites, and interventions together. By uncovering realities previously unseen and fostering new connections between them, new spaces of possibilities can be imagined. To conclude, the project is a rhizomatic trope on the network of art movement and its unstable shifting nodes, a kind of schizophrenic scanning, a relentless lateral movement over a medial mode of thought. It brings visibility to the disappearance of art, ruptures stability of institutional figures, and reorganizes the art network by collapsing the binaries of black and white spaces, instead presenting different shades of gray. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are you bringing your own laptop? That was great. I don't know if I can summarize everybody's project in a sentence, but I can always try. There was a really good conversation around the nature, at least I thought, around the nature of complexity and coherence, because actually a lot of the work in your unit has multiple layers, multiple references. It goes deep into aspects of theory, and to pull that together into something that can be communicated also with an architectural intelligence, and that goes beyond, architecture as building, but architecture as discipline or a set of skills. Is really phenomenal, and actually, your panel did you good justice. So,
Hi, I'm Rachel from Diploma 7. My project is called Behind the Facade and is a provocation of a contested heritage. And so the project offers a retelling of the city of Bristol through its domestic spaces to reveal the relationship between property speculation and the transatlantic slave trade, and interrogate the forces that continue to conceal and preserve these associations today. In July 2020, the government published a document entitled Contested Heritage, which firstly outlined their meaning of heritage as offering either an architectural interest through importance in its design, decoration, and craftsmanship, or historic interest through association with the nation's history, important individuals, or events. And secondly, outlined their approach to the subject, to retain and explain. Unquestionably facilitated through a system of listing buildings, conservation protocol, and planning policy frameworks, and rationalised through hidden academic reports and statements. In St Paul's, Bristol, Portland and Brunswick Square was first designated a conservation area in 1974 and is the only Grade 1 listed square in the city with the highest percentage of listed buildings within its boundary. The conservation area prescribes formal green spaces, preserve facade lines, as well as areas of negative impact. Yet despite the role of heritage to preserve historic fabric, the recent restoration of the square reveals very little of its past, hidden behind false facades. As it was in the residential squares of Bristol's inner city that in the late 18th century, slave trade wealth was funneled into Georgian terraced housing. Portland Square itself was developed by James Lockyer, a timber merchant with mahogany plantations in Honduras in the 1790s. However, during its construction, coincidentally around the age of abolitionism, Lockyer went bankrupt, leaving many houses unfinished. My archival research shows further changes into the 19th century, spurred on by industrialisation and processing of imported goods such as sugar and tobacco, as well as exported goods such as Bristol brass and cast iron. And so many of the central buildings of the square were converted from residential use to warehouses, with their interiors stripped of all decorative interest and their exteriors disfigured by paint signs. Therefore, by the 1950s, the houses left behind were big and spacious and the rents cheap, lending themselves easily to multi-occupation. And so the area soon became associated as a gateway district for newly arrived migrants to the city. This change in character, combined with the increasing stigmatisation of the area as a reputational ghetto, fuelled by racist incentive evidenced in the outcome of the 1980s St Paul's riots, perhaps shines a new light on the true intention of the conservation area boundary of 1974. Not to preserve an architectural or historic interest, but to fix the social issues outlined in the negative character appraisal. Despite the fact that what was actually seen during this period of change is the reclamation of the square by new residents to provide buildings that suited their own community needs, such as the infamous Bamboo Club, one of the first to admit members regardless of race or class, or St Paul's African Caribbean Carnival, founded by the activists of the Windrush generation in 1968, whose parade still commences in Portland Square annually today. This period of adaptation saw buildings change from domestic to industrial, recreational, and cultural use, provoking the question, in conserving architecture, who decides which histories or events are worthy of national heritage and which are not? And moving now to the scale of the house, Historic England suggests that it's the intentions of the original developer that should be given priority, and that any alternative adaptations require clear and convincing justification. And so as the final section of Portland Square is restored to its original elevation today, we question, are the intentions of James Lockyer, the original developer and a slave trader, the most appropriate to reinstate? And does its restoration erase more memory than it preserves? When stepping into the home reveals more of the material traces of a contested heritage, such as brass, cast iron and timber elements, directly produced or obtained in order to sustain the slave trade. Yet Historic England's question remains, will the proposal respect existing materials when panelling, doors and trim are clad in Caribbean mahogany? And how will the proposal affect surviving interior finishes when embellished Georgian fireplaces display the crest of the Society of Merchant Venturers or, quote, West Indian figures? Or whether the original hierarchy of rooms remains present when central stairwells and below-ground levels are designed to push servants' quarters and unwanted food smells to the rear rooms. Warehouses, often hidden at the back, reveal the true nature of the original residents' business ventures, and the preserved facade keeps public and private life separate, leaving behind a catalogue of contested elements, contested through their materiality, through their ornamentation, and through their organisation. With these hidden traces now revealed, I look to the other side of the Atlantic and the influence of the slave trade upon another intertwined typology, where it becomes clear that it was not only African slaves that were traded and transported, but also construction knowledge, local building techniques, and materials. And so we witness a change in the former British colonies of the Caribbean from embedding timber structures within stone in the act of the conqueror to make native architectures more permanent, to an adoption of Caribbean building techniques by the same Bristolian building promoters to adapt their great stone houses to be more resilient to the turbulent tropical climate. And so in the latter half of the 18th century, a new house type emerges, the Creole house. Creole architecture, as explored by J. Edwards, is characterised by its mixing of cultural influences and thus a direct consequence of colonialism. In the Jamaican type, this is seen in the decorative and organisational features of the British Georgian house that sit within the nogged timber frame of the Jamaican home. Yet the two often sit in tension with each other in a sequence of adaptation, where original timber post and ground construction is engulfed by a stone basement. The timber nogged frame that sits on top, with polished mahogany floorboards, dictating one story of living space, is infilled with masonry, and decorated with portico detailing and hanging cornices. And in the case of Thorpe's townhouse, the upper floor is additionally plastered and scored to look like a two-storey stone house. A braced roof structure sits on top, typically hipped and low in profile, and openings are filled with sash windows alongside Jamaican ventilation blinds called jalousies. But in the Great House at Mount Plenty, a later adaptation shows a further wrapping in the form of a piazza, a terraced gallery around the full perimeter of the house, with a separate structure that was sacrificial during the storms. The dual influence creates a home within a home, often expressing one influence more than the other, and producing a set of specific characteristics that define the merged Creole type. And so in returning to Bristol, I wish to speculate upon the often overlooked two-way nature of this process and question how much the Creole typology influenced these terrace houses that emerged later into the 17th century by returning ships captains, such as these built by Llewellyn Evans and John Knight on Markin Street, or again James Lockyer in Clifton, with distinct characteristics seen both across the city and the Caribbean. Drawing the conclusion that the two typologies are not so distinct, and that through its materiality, construction, colonial associations, and familiar trajectory of concealing behind a facade, it could be claimed that the Georgian terraced house is in itself a Creole type. This deconstruction begins to break down the illusion of a total heritage and invites a further interrogation of its parts through dismantling. Would its value remain the same when cut into and these traces revealed? What's left to retain once extended and subverted? What possibilities would be opened up when punctured and pushed back, in order to convey an asymmetrical heritage and an alternative framework for managing future change? This model of number 27 and 28 Portland Square offers a testing ground for these deconstructive acts, imagining a continuation of the square's history to make visible the tensions that are often left more explicit in the continuous construction and reconstruction of the Creole house, giving new reverence to impermanent structures and reconfiguring the structural hierarchy, where timber wraps and offloads the stone so that we question if a retained facade becomes undermined by a new timber frame, what is the purpose of its preservation at all? Then we might start to consider that every adaptation satisfies historic England's definition of heritage in offering an architectural or historic interest. Having provoked the dismantling of heritage through its structural components, the project continues to unpick these ties through its terminology, viewing the subject from an alternative perspective in a process of reverse archaeology, where redefining the Georgian terrace house as another variation of the Creole type, a term inherently ambiguous in its origins, meaning, and value, makes reverting the square back to some sort of absolute British heritage impossible. As shown in these Creole typological plans, the two cannot be disassociated. And so this traditional conservatism that Retain and Explain aims to uphold is overwritten to allow for new possibilities, pushing one subject of interest back, or subverting it to a different plane to allow others to be revealed and opened up. This process of dissection problematizes preservation by instead allowing for acts that uncover and upturn, stripping details of their symbolism and returning them to pragmatism, which begs the question, once these symbols of heritage are pushed back and fragmented, does what remains hold the same value, or does this disruption risk unraveling the purpose of listed buildings, the need for a heritage at all? In Dillon, Secretary of State for Housing, the Supreme Court posed the question whether the dismantled components of something which had unquestionably been a listed building could, by the process of dismantling, become chattels rather than buildings, and thereby lose their statutory protection as such. The same case offered the explanation that in the instance these elements are fixed in place by nothing other than their own weight, they must be separately listed as buildings in their own right. And so for this offered example, the act of offloading the facade would detach it from the listing as a whole, pointing to the fragility of these systems built upon definition. These lino molds depicting an unfolded plan explore what it would be to view preservation not as a hierarchy of histories, but a catalogue of historic facts, an asymmetrical heritage, an ambiguity of value. Then original materials and intentions are free to be reinterpreted, facades cut open and chimneys centred, elevations flipped and materials transferred, outside brought in and inside free to be extended out. By blind embossing, we ridicule the production of a protected whole, enabling ghosts of the past to inform new futures, the traces left untold. In Kirsty Bell's words, the view that my window frames is an extraction, but not exactly a slice through time. Rather, it cuts across the different axes to examine the continuity of place. If I were to flip it from the vertical to the horizontal plane, The rectangular field it pegs out would be an archaeological site of sorts to dig into with the imagination and sift its contents for nuggets of the past.
Thanks again. I'm kind of so happy to kind of have this topic with such a great audience because it's such an important one. I think that so many times we talk about decolonization as something to do with, I don't know, symbolism, etc., but that's embedded in a form of knowledge that comes through in architecture that is transatlantic, global, deep in a history. It's a beautiful thesis as much as anything else. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Ferial. Desert Anxieties proposes to draw continuity between France and its former colony Algeria by asking how was the French territory shaped by French encounters with the Sahara. Biskra, the 28th of June. The expedition continues. We have left Constantine and Batna with its rain, snow, and cold. Here we approach the desert again. This postcard represents exactly this limit of the rainy and sunny regions. I do not know who George is, and yet the postcard positions his gaze. Writing from colonized Biskra at the edge of the Algerian Sahara, he introduces his reader to this gorge, captioned "The Doorway to the Desert." From this vantage point, he has not yet entered the desert, and in fact, he cannot. Indeed, to locate himself, George relies on topographical markers such as the road or the gorge dipping down at the center. To interpret the desert's flatness, he needs it to contrast with the objects in the front. The landscape becomes a compositional device which helps him decode what he cannot see. To tell the story of the French colonial gaze is therefore to investigate the logic of its composition. From the French normative landscape to the viewpoint to the frame to the object, what one sees is determined by how one looks and where from. Indeed, behind the image, the recipient of George's letters stands in the forested region of the Maritime Alps. As such, read from this vantage point, the desert is born in the forests of France. The forest was not always a landscape of reference, but instead very much the locus of anxieties. Indeed, it is a known tale that in the forest, one risks encountering the wolf. The myth of the forest was plagued the French psyche. Stemming from the Latin foris, meaning outside, the forest embodied the uncivilized, constructing a latent anxiety of the unknown. As a foil to the civilized ordered interior, the forest was used to prove it. Yet as the French were encountering the Sahara, the perception of the forest was shifting from the exterior to the interior, acquitted by a French identity in construction. The forest was rebranded with artists operating between the image and the actual forest preservation, working to reframe it. The use of perspective helped redefine it. Meandering down a path through the forest, one emerges in a clearing. The vanishing point is a home. The trees structure the viewer's trajectory so that here one is not lost, but rather guided to a place of comfort. In contrast, the constructed desert has no perspective, no possibility to escape the frame, the desolation foregrounded by a camel's skeleton. The colonial venture had relocated anxieties of the forest to this still uncharted Algeria. By anchoring its territorial anxieties in the desert, the Sahara became integral to the French collective psyche, binding the two territories by mirroring forests and sands. Yet this displaced anxiety is part of a broader matrix of links and continuities between the two countries, such as infrastructures facilitating the flow of people, to historic thresholds such as forts and desert doorways, to the re-engineering of topographical depressions and exclusive trade agreements on natural resources. France and Algeria became drawn not by their external borders, but by the reconfiguration of the colonial interior into a landscape of interconnected points, lines, and fields. The relationship of the forest and its desert are therefore one sample of continuity at a cross between forest, sand, and emptiness. Examining the desert as a binding phenomenon transports us to the Landes, along the Atlantic, dubbed the desert of France, and the region of La Rouate, along the Sahara's northern edge. I argue that the anxiety that bound them transformed the two territories, with the aim of containing the desert. Putting the two regions in conversation reveals that the colonial mindset of agrarian productivity registered the land as it registered the Sahara: pastoral, unproductive, and full of sand, a desert. The law in both France and Algeria participated in manufacturing this view of the territory, then projected onto the land. So in the land, the decree of 1857 above alienated the pastoralists from their common lands, stating that grazing lands will be sanitized, planted with forest, and exploited through the forced sale of these new properties. In Algeria, the Varnier Law of 1863 would claim as state domain all forests and unregistered lands, leading to the similar sequestration of vast expanses of grazing lands and their progressive afforestation. Mapping the parallel transformations means drawing the two according to one logic, bound by the legend. Initial settlements relied on pastoral activities, nomadic in the case of La Rouache, which is the site of spring grazings, before migrating north, then south, and back up for summers, then winters. The introduction of fixing infrastructure, such as reservoirs in Algeria, drainage ditches in the land, led to their major afforestation. The towns, some new, expanded to accommodate the pastoralists, now with limited access to land for their cattle. In both cases, the threat was the same: the desert, as a vague notion against which the forest was the only barrier. Abstracted in this way, could one argue that the two territories, shaped by this desert anxiety, are in fact one? The transformation is complete in the land, made productive through resin extraction. In Algeria, the French afforestation projects were resuscitated in the 1970s under the banner of the Green Dam, a major project to stop desertification along the northern edge of the Sahara. So the ambition builds on the logic of the land, with consultation from the World Bank, proposing to introduce private investment of the forest plantations by focusing on the economic benefits of trees, from their fruits to carbon sequestration. It is not fate, but instead disentanglement, which means that both territories are plagued by forest fires due to the highly combustible pine. And when all is turned to ash, how can one begin to tell them apart? Instead, encoded in each site is the image of the other. This reading is more than a parallel. The land became a site for framing the desert, and in so doing, for fixing it. The ensuing resortification of the Côte des Landes rested on the supposed containment. The string of resort towns which spread along the coast all played on this imaginary, branding the dune that could be overcome. Within this frame, the anxiety was tamed. The enclosure of these lands introduced a logic of estates, which drew in a bourgeois urban crowd, treading the thin line between fear and fascination of the desert. On his property along the Arcachon Basin, Antoine de Sauvage would introduce camels to till the land. They would not survive the harsh winters. However, the castle remains. The estate subsists as a winery, placing both camel and wine on the same French cultural stage. On the other side of the Arcachon Basin, the Lesca brothers, back from working as engineers in Algeria, would purchase thousands of hectares to plant them with pine. On their transformed plot, the desert was now rampant, haunting not only the landscape, but also the architecture. Indeed, the Algerian villa and its chapel, which they had built in the 1880s, were rife with vague Oriental references. From the crescent and Arabic inscriptions, to the horseshoe arches, to the minarets and recessed porticos. But are they really absurd in this landscape? The villa sits along the edge of the artificial forest of the estate, meant to protect it from the desert. But in fact, the containment is precarious. Along the Arcachon Basin, the desert, now limited to the coastal sands, is fixed by a network of ditches to drain the swampy lands and guarantee the survival of the pine buffer. Over time, this strategy created absurdities along the shores, introducing more desert where everything was done to suppress it. Perhaps then, the desert is in fact unavoidable. Indeed, as the coast continues to erode, the dunes shift inwards and up. The sands blown inland submerge the pines, and in so doing make real the desert's anxiety. Taking for sample the pine forest encircling the villa, the aim is to dismantle the artificial fixing of the dune contained between the sea and the forest by introducing a fire safety code, clearing cuts through the trees to slow down the inevitable blazes. To create the buffers, the pine, planted at 3 meters distance, are either cut, leaving a bare trunk, or uprooted if they lie on a path. Within a dense forest plot, a clearing is made at the lowest point to slow down the fire's progress and connected to either edges of the plantation by a cut. In another scenario, the edge between the dunes planted with fixing grasses and the forest is cleared, halting any spread from the beach towards the pines. The paths leading to the beach are also widened, and the trees uprooted. Finally, around all sites nestled within the forest, from cemeteries to parking lots and fracking rigs, a buffer is similarly cleared. The process claims to protect the forest, while in fact clearing strips from the coast inland. These cuts act as a trigger for the sands fixed along the shores to begin penetrating the forest, and over time allow the deserts to expand, returning the landscape to its former self. The process, this flattening of the landscape, redrafts our relationship with the image of the desert. Indeed, the land's counter-image is fundamentally surreal, challenging our eye's proclivity to see what it wants to see and determine what should exist where. The Algerian villa, once a device to domesticate the desert, becomes engulfed by this landscape it initially fought to conceal. In this framing, the horizon line becomes a protagonist in the transformation. Cutting through the trees does not simply return the landscape to its former composition, but exposes its irrationalities, triggering a mirage in this changed environment. Were the trees then just an illusion conjured by French desire? As the sand reclaims the forest, it exposes what was once historically obscured, offering a palette for the desert to reclaim its own image. Thank you. And free Palestine.
I might give up my attempts to do this at every moment. It's just a wonderful presentation. I think when we were talking about it earlier this morning, the number of people on your panel who talked about just the memory of hearing you talk, and actually to see it again, it's an extraordinary. You conjure up a kind of mysteriousness in the way in which you describe the project that sits in a really wonderful and curious opposition to the severity of the topic. It's just beautifully pitched and a beautiful project, so congratulations.
Hi, I'm Hiroaki from Dip 11. As the formed fragments get informed. So inform should give a form, and then deform should give up a form. But is it so? So through minimization of entropy and exclusion of ambiguity, information give a city a form that is increasingly categorizable and predictable, while the value of deformation is rather overlooked in the process of urbanization. So my proposition is important. And my proposition critiques this adversarial effect of information and then proposes a reassemblage pipeline, a new layer of network that weaves through London. So once these scraps from AA, from workshop AA are sorted, it can take a form, like the arrangement of matter. So those fragments are the negatives of attempts or memories while the students were developing their concept into shape. Each piece could be attributed to each student and may remind them of their last models. Then I'm wondering, this assemblage, can it be done in a city scale? Imagine looking at the Thames and noticing the barge is transporting something, wondering what that was, where this is going to. So waterways were used for transporting various goods, and barges were everywhere, and the chimneys were punctuating the cityscapes, and the cranes were relentlessly lifting goods off from the water. However, this industrial cityscape is long gone from London, and only left with the traces of them. So this residual equipment have lost its industrial utility. In the current landscape of post-industrial conservations, those fragments are preserved only to be seen, not to function. The object on the verge was from this Battersea power station surrounded by this commercial storefront. It once regulated this high voltage from the turbine engines, but now it's unplugged from the network of the use. It's simply left for exhibition. The same goes for this shed with truncated cantilevers by the canal, used to lift this large quantity of timber for furniture manufacturing. It has been vacant for several decades. So if equipment may lie in an intermediate position between things and work, and simultaneously may oscillate between half-hour work and something less, what does it become when it loses its utility? One of the primary drivers of the Industrial Revolution was this adaptation of steam engines, steam pumps, which led to understanding of entropy, inevitable heat loss, later formulated into second laws of thermodynamics. The entropy is this energy that cannot put into any useful work. So given the equipment is the form arranged from utility, and the form without the utility may imply that they are in this high entropic state. So entropy is represented in the form of art. For example, the Lober-Smithson's land art that blurs the context and the work. Gustav Metzger's autodestructive art disintegrates over time. And Ilya Kovakov, who takes the trash as a symbol for memory and oblivion. So all these artists exemplify the value in the discarded or deformed object, but this notion does not seem too prominent in the urban development, capturing obsessively to why this is the case in urban development. So laying out all the conservation areas in London. So there's this strip, the Limehouse Cut conservation area that located in the Tower Hamlet. So this labor exchange building does not exist in the Limehouse Cut anymore, only a few images available online. So this building prompted this designation of this Limehouse Cut by the council's a reactionary promotion against this developer's planning application to demolish this building, but later quashed by the High Court of Justice on the ground that the misleading material omissions in the officer's report. So looking at the town plan from late 19th century, and plotting all the factories and works, it is apparent that from this concentration of the dots, how the cut was used for integration of the industry. And I divided the cut into 37 points, and then walked to each spot. Then I photographed with my analog camera, and simultaneously with iPhones. Then I extracted the EXIF data for mapping, and you can see the iPhone geolocation registration is constantly noisy, it's not really precise. The location data is then assigned to this physical film strip. As the negatives are digitized, the strip is flattened into the sequence of simple binary bits. Disassembling the image, equipment once integral to the industrial activities are found along the cut, but it looks rusted and unused. Again, statically museumified and out from the network of the use. The buildings and structure removed from the industrial scape are only recognizable when associated with the historical images. The demolition the planning application for demolition mostly proposes to convert it into residential or office buildings. Barely seem to contribute to preserve or enhance the industrial character of the site that conservation appraisal advises. So the LSE reports on economic impacts on conservation areas highlights this how conservation areas is a key contribution to the financial premium, to the property values, and its correlation between the value the rise of this financial premium and the duration of designation. So the value of the water is not anymore associated with the value of logistics and manufacturing communication along the cut. Well, water is better not to disturb for the sake of financial premium. It has become a commodity attribute for potential buyers. As seen in industrial equipment leftovers that we saw, the canals are also museumified. Resist against minimizing entropy. So the entropy, another one, this here is not the one with the bottom. There's another one called the Shannon's information entropy. So this is one of the most important layer of deep neural network where it uses it as a cross entropy function. What this thing does is this function to calculate the discrepancy between what human labeled and also what machine predicted. So by minimizing these gaps, and to calculate this distance, they use this function called cosmic entropy function, which is Shannon's entropy. So machines are already trading much, much faster than human trader, and also making better investment decisions in the human analysis than the human analysis in some cases. The parallel emerges when comparing between the financial practice and machine learning process. The machine learning minimizes loss of cross-entropy function to attain more accurate training models, and finance's due diligence is to to minimize the potential losses, and by reducing investment uncertainty for procurement. The finance is inseparable from the architecture, and this process of minimization of information entropy to make this investment safe, predictable for procurement. And as this trajectory accelerates, the form of architecture is undoubtedly affected by this investment cycle. So towards easy to categorize and safe and predictable form of architecture. I propose this reassemblage pipeline to subvert this by throwing this deformed and high entropy fragments in the cycle of production. So remember the circuit breakers on the verge. It will be removed. I removed this. And then, but with a location, time, and verge ID and fragment ID, they're all assigned. As it passes through all the bridges in London, it logs when this is going through and what types of budge it's carrying these fragments. Yeah. So the camera will be attached to on each bridge. Take this things called a slit scan. So this is a slit scan. But this representation of this fragment is I intentionally make this deformed. So this is what it looks like in a slit scan on today's discussion among tutors in library for these owners. And sorry for not asking for permission, but you cannot be recognized by this human vision APIs, compose associations. So there is this unique overlap. Yeah, there's this unique overlap. So this blue area is a conservation area, yeah, and the red area is actually proposal site for waste management plot. So there's this like interesting overlap of this slot, this gold stuff. This is what I'm proposing my small intervention. So as a Limehouse cut is one of the blue ribbon network, the London's strategic waterway. We're going to use this canal system. So the cut becomes a place for integration again, gathering all the equipment into here. So gantry that's been chopped out needs to be rehabilitated. And then maybe to lift this retired circuit breaker or pumps or maybe turbine generator, it will be lifted up and then pushed into this shed. The gantry assigns this weight trait to these fragments, but it also generates this point cloud of the fragments by constant scanning. The mechanics meticulously disassembled, occasionally joined by this urban archaeologist. Some fragments may be cleaned, then it will once again take a photogrammetry of the parts. Then with each piece will get another unique IDs. The various metal testing are also taking place, such as bendiness or fatigue tests or whatsoever. Those traits are constantly added to these fragments. So now the dimensions traits are available. Packing algorithm can organize relentlessly, effortlessly. The neatly organized arrangement contrasts against distorted reflection of the view. The array of pedestal presents this data set of fragments and projected fragments that are matched with its online search criteria. The people can search as if they are having chat with the scraps, fragments. Sorry, I was saying over this. Okay. So maybe a repairman needs a metal sheets for patching some parts. Researchers inspect traces of industrial history. Artists hunt for their sculptural piece, or media artists utilize this data set for their digital works. So this is the pipeline that is a shared interface for professions with different backgrounds and interest. So once the discarded fragments are discarded fragments are no more indistinguishable from digital or physical, the character of fragments emerge from accumulation of these traits. More and more retired equipments are seen on the Thames and Canal. So the shed is not only for integration, but also it distributes using this canal network while tracking all the movement of shipment of this new use cases. This excessive amount of data will be captured by this, needs to be stored, but it should be kept locally and then distributed extensively in the city. So rather than the remote places concealed in the middle of nowhere, it should coexist in the cityscapes. Just as the industrial equipment punctuated the scene, the repository become part of the infrastructure. It is the repository that holds the information in fragments with a certain level of redundancy. As the information technology removed this typology of signal boxes with wide cockpit of view of the city, the signalmans are put into these viewless operating centers with desk with flashing LED in front of them, not so different from day traders of finance. So like this signal box, the repository may resemble what's removed from the city, but composed with the fragments all across the city. Why not let the repository or these data servers stay there then? Is it absurd for a machine to have such a great view of the city, or we are the ones who's absurd who took away the view of the city? The repository will be built around London and share the information of the discarded entities produced from the urban metabolism. This is a new industry of obsessive capture, which archives the progression of urbanization through the lens of what's deformed. As deformed fragments get informed, this is my proposal for conservation in the age of excessive minimization of entropy. Thank you.
Right. I think I officially give up. Thanks, Hiro. No, in all seriousness, I think that there's something really extraordinary of something that can operate across so many levels and still really deal with ideas of indeterminacy, whilst also involving kind of high-level economics. I'm very curious about what happens next. But that can be a conversation for later. Fantastic, though. Thanks.
Hello. Hi, I'm Maria, and my project is called Can the Unseen Speak? To briefly explain, my project seeks reparations from colonial violence and its legacies through performance as activist acts and speculative objects that culminates into film.
The sun was incredibly unforgiving that day, but perhaps on most days in this part of South Sumatra. They say it's the perfect climate to grow the palm oil tree, between 30 to 32 degrees. That's why they loved it there. So they turned it into a living laboratory to grow cash crops for cheap and make their fortune. This lust for profit led to widespread abuse, working people to death in confined spaces, bodies forced into rows, and in a repetitive motion they go. Sorting crops for the colonial master, paid for nothing, tortured, beaten, suspended by their toes or thumbs until they broke. The cultivation system and the coolie ordinances of the 1800s in the Dutch East Indies resulted in mass atrocities. Fast forward 200 years later, things remain somewhat the same. The only difference is that the Indonesian state has now become the aggressor, inheriting the abusive practices of the Dutch. The obsessive need to own, claim, and tame things that are foreign to them, to be able to control and extract, like the savages they never were, but have learned to become. Trees used to grow wild here. Now it's either bare or foreign things grow on it like they don't belong. I felt the rhythm of the plantation on my body. The palm oil tree was transported to Sumatra by the Dutch from Africa in the 19th century. The discipline of botany drove the business of transporting plants, making glass cases for its safekeeping, the guardian case, they call it, only then to impose these new plants into new environments that require an aggressive conditioning, deforesting and burning peatlands to the point of no return. To set up large-scale plantations, setting us out to become dependent on an economy of extraction based on plantation production. And so we got lost and ended up here.
Nama saya Ria Susanti. Saya 5 anak. Anak saya Padilla Rahma, sakit hispa. Saat itu Padilla Rahma, anak saya berumur 1,5 tahun. Sakitnya batuk pilek, sesak napasnya. Dioper ke rumah sakit umum karena kurang alatnya di rumah sakit Siti Khadijah. Semingguan di rumah sakit umum kejang, lalu disuntik oleh perawat, muntah darah, langsung koma. Saya panggil perawat sampai 3 kali nggak ada yang bangun. Suami saya manggil perawat untuk ngisiin infus, nggak juga bangun sampai azan subuh. Nggak ada hamil lagi. Pasnya pas azan subuhnya. Saat itu kacau, sedih. Suami saya yang marah.
Apa yang Ibu Padilla?
Saya berjualan, saya gendong. Pada saat itu belum bisa berjalan, digendong sambil berjualan. Asap-asap itu masih saya berjualan. Gelap, asap semua. Ya. Sesak. Lama, 2 bulanan.
2 bulan? 2 bulan kayak gitu? Terus pada saat itu Ibu tetap berjualan?
Iya, iya.
Kalau ada Padilla sekarang di hadapan Ibu, apa yang ingin Ibu sampaikan? Silakan.
Kalau ada sekarang, Ibu sayang Padilla. Semua sayang sama Padilla.
As the Javanese with animist roots, my ancestors believe in the presence of the unseen, In Indonesia, religions are syncretized with these animist roots, performed in rituals that become a hybrid of such a plurality. As syncretics, we believe in commemorating the unseen, the transient, and the dead. Through rituals of extraction or offerings with objects that are imbued with spirits. And in this tradition, I designed a prayer with Ibu Ria to commemorate her daughter, transmitting the prayer into a blown glass as a vessel that is in itself an extension of breath, of life.
Mari kita doa bareng. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. A'udzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. A'udzubillahi Malik yaumiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdinas siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim waladdallin. Amin.
The ritual continues, commemorating those who have died on the plantation fields, collecting burnt peat as evidence of the transient, of toxic haze, marking the deaths of those who have been sacrificed for the extractive economy. The ritual ends, commemorating the life and death of the air we collectively breathe, collecting air embodied as a reminder to conserve those who keep us alive, the unseen, the transient, and all that's living. Labor exploitation on palm oil plantations remains rampant. Workers are abused, underpaid, and denied basic health rights. So I propose offering workers the Sumatran martial arts tradition of silat reinterpreted as a restitutional dance that embodies the dynamics of wind and smoke. Disguised as a leisurely activity to unite them, providing support to break from the arduous demands of the plantation. Their collective strength is mobilized, disseminating dissidents, harnessing their collective fury to disembody the forced discipline of plantation labor during breaks. Extending breaks into the ritualizing of plantation grounds, superimposing talang mama, rituals of offerings as markings of their ancestral land, imposing an indigenous time for when planting and harvest is appropriate under the sovereignty of the unseen. And so I returned to where it all started, carrying vessels that contain the life and death of those sacrificed for the plantation economy, walking the boundary of a plantation fragment to demarcate Q grounds with my body, as an ephemeral marker to unlearn Cartesian methods of delineating ground, bringing the haze with me, as the model that does not obey fixed boundaries, the way in which colonial and nation states try to do so, to own, claim, and control its subjects. Learning from smoke plumes illustrated by plumic bodies as a series of chemical reactions between particulate matter, constantly interacting with its surrounding environment, constantly changing its shape. I enter the Palm House, a former colonial laboratory for botany. Before the oil palm was planted for testing in Bogor, it was examined here. So I bury in this pot Sumatran peat that has been sacrificed. And on the second floor of the palm house, between 30 to 32 degrees, a microclimate is created to keep tropical palms alive, like how they did in Sumatra, a microclimate of extreme heat from keeping oil palms alive. To Ibu Ria, I scatter your prayer on the waters of Q, so we can eternally remember Fadila, so that this place becomes a memorial for her.
Syukur oleh wong tapa ingkang awasa mungkul tan mikir pawewehing liyan iku pantes sira guranana kaki.
The project doesn't end at a resolution. It is perhaps only the beginning of holding the longer process of seeking reparations and holding perpetrators accountable, drawing a contested site with my body as a way to unlearn Cartesian methods of delineating ground becomes architecture in itself. Bridging the gap between Cartesian separation of subject and object requires what Indonesian journalist Ayu Utami calls rasa, described as this, not only the spiritual but intellectual capacity of a people. Rasa is the sum of feeling, sense, and empathy. And as a mechanism, rasa doesn't care too much about logical consistency. In confronting perpetrators, rasa looks to also humanize them. So before we can cross spatial boundaries, these relational boundaries must first be crossed. And only then can we start to rehabilitate wounded landscapes, never alone, but together. Learning from the local spirit of gotong royong or mutual aid, it is only through the collective strength of a people that we can perhaps work towards a resolution. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's tremendously hard to follow. I think the panel when we were discussing upstairs, it's something that's pitched so carefully and so completely. I think someone said there isn't a second that's wrong, and it's a beautiful piece of work. I do know that is the beginning of something much bigger. I think it needs a bigger audience. I think it's a fantastic piece of work. I hope we can find a way of exhibiting it further. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Alex from DIP 17. My project is called Disjunction. It aims to recontextualize the peripheral industrial town of Einses, located in the Austrian Alps, through framing views towards the industrial sites and summits of hikes. The building is a platform that disrupts the existing industrial continuum of this microcosm. As an outsider, Einses is experienced through the scenic drive, hikes, and skiing trails. These leisurely activity is overlaid on top of a highly programmed and organized productive landscape, where it operates autonomously but can impact the life of many outside of its physical boundary. Einses was developed for the mining of iron ore and the manufacturing of steel. It had more than 10,000 people at its peak, with more than 4,000 people working in the industry, but now it has lost more than half of its population, with only a few hundred working the mine. In response to structure change, Einstein aimed to establish a tourism sector through its industrial heritage, which will be integrated in the wider industrial network of the Leoben district in Styria. Hiking trail that links the declining industrial sites are established, attracting several thousand people to the town during peak season. At times, this can be more than the population of Einstein. However, upon deepened scrutiny, such glorification of the former industrial sites undermines other relationship between industry and the peripheral landscape. As the industrial town only gained its scales after the Anschluss, the mine and the steel mill were integrated into the Reichswerk, a Nazi industrial conglomerate founded by Hermann Göring. Between 1938 and 1945, the Nazi expanded the mine and steel mill, where within the city they built major settlement units for the influx of workers and concentration camp for forced labor. To borrow Hannah Arendt's quotes in the original Totalitarianism, the musefication of Einstein is taking what was good in the past and simply calling it our heritage. To discard the bad and simply think it's a dead load, which time by itself will bury in oblivion. Rather than visiting the site with a map from the tourist office, I took this reconstructed sketch from a former victim of the concentration camp as my guide to Einstein. The former sites of the concentration camp is now a log terminal for the seasonal harvest. The mine seems like a monument that stands there quietly, rather than a site of extraction. The place of massacre at the end of the war is now a local family ski resort. During the holiday season, the transformed worker housing will fill up once again for the influx of people. The current approach to Einstein does not only undermine the absolute evil, but more importantly, it neglects the banal evil of neighboring without critical thought on the overall system. In contrast, the elevated slope where one can escape the microcosm, stare deep into the abyss, the mind and body for once is detached from the rigorous laboring routine, reading and understanding the layers of the periphery. This form of theoretical work requires a space to reflect and act upon. However, Einstein's monodiscipline structure lacks space to encapsulate these thoughts and host public action. The abyss junction is formed of three shells that respond to the past and present in their views and programs. Integrated into the existing hiking trail is a platform for contemplation and public action. The building's form is derived from the vista on site. The shells fence outward to the views, problematizing the amnesia and the continuum of the industry and war. As Makoje once said, tourism is an accomplished form of war, and Einstein is shifting from one industrial dependency to another. The archive and the reading space in the eastern shells has an opaque sloping roof, working with the column to frame the slab heap, accumulated mostly during the war. The framing and the documentation recontextualize the former industrial sites. The shell in the middle will host exhibition focusing on contemporary issue, and an amphitheater that has a circular layout allowing a multi-directional glaze and for a non-hierarchical conversation. The shell in the west is semi-open and has a transparent covering. It dips onto the ground, orienting toward the views onto the patchy forest on the slope, highlighting the current industrial activities of Styria. The state is often known as the Green Heart of Austria. 61% of the region is covered by forests. These forests are not only the backbone of Austrian timber production, they are also the foundation of the country's industrialization process. The material consumption of the industrial age is expressed through the monoculture of spruce on the slope and the forest formation of stacker bowl patches that have turned the landscape into a barcode that represents serial mass production. The infrastructure of the timber industry in Austria is set up for the processing of softwood, and spruce is preferred for their fast growth and ease of machining. The shop floor of the sawmill, glue lamp, and CLT factory I visited were mostly empty. All the material expertise are embedded in the program, where the machine will scan the log to determine the cutting arrangement, treating defects such as knots in the plank. Human attention can only be seen toward the end of the production line for visual quality control. However, there are a wide range of species of soft and hardwood in the Alps, and Austria is going through a process to rediversify their slopes. By thinning out the spruce population, species such as ash, oak, and beech are repopulated naturally. The design comprises of two systems, utilizing straight, standardized rectangular timber plank to form the structure of the building. The sequential dowel column aims to respond to the monoculture of spruce of the current timber industry in Austria. I was interested in how augmented reality will shift the dynamic of construction process. With this model, I explore how the visual guide will allow me to drill holes to bind soft and hardwood together without using glue. The polyculture assembly technique will use different species for different parts of the structure that will fit their material properties. They will be doweled together with different moisture contents. The roof plank will serve as an agent to deliver moisture to the rest of the structure, and the hardwood joints will be drier as their expansion will create the compression property for the column. The deployed structure will utilize different cut profiles. As softwood tends to go faster, they will be used for the roof planks and the horizontal plank to form the column, and the hardwood will be used as the joints. The column will form the crust of the shell for a gallery level. They will provide a less formal engagement with the program below, creating an impromptu interaction with the passerby. Below the gallery of the shell hosting the assembly hall are exhibition spaces for contemporary issue. Working with the documentation of the Eastern Shell, they facilitate the conversation inside the building. The grid shell is constructed with a fragmented method, using the member that has the same section to form the large span space for the project. The member of the fragments are pre-cut with sliding slot for the joint. The projected augmented reality will work with the tensioning joint, allowing the fragment to be bent into place at a human scale. The reduction of construction scale will allow for a more engaging process in working the material. While orienting glaze, the grid shall amplify the seasonal aspect, and the ribbing of the zinc roof will guide those toward the retainer at the edge, merging the building with the landscape. The enclosure of the shell will respond to the program while creating contrast in views across the building. The two-system model project does not seek to use technology for labor abstraction. The transfer of knowledge is supported by the construction process. It bridges digital manufacturing with human intuition. At a regional scale, they respond to the current effort in diversifying the alpine slope, with the polyculture system that blends soft and hardwood together. They will be deployed on site to form a constellation of spaces, hosting programs to facilitate a reading of the periphery beyond its face value. The three shells are linked together with a canopy that forms a rear courtyard, bleeding the building's activity into landscape. At the front, the canopy creates a passage that allows people to circulate into and around the building, engaging the body with the seasonal slope. The BIS junction seeks to reacquaint one with the increasingly alienating peripheral landscape, while being critical to its function and meaning. Within INSIS, the project disrupts the amnesia and the continuum between industry and war. In addition, the project questioned the current and challenged shift from one monodiscipline to another. It creates a pause amongst routine from different walks of life, questioning what one's laboring process will constitute to. Is it right? How can it be different? Can it be stopped? It's a point of departure for the individual journey and a place where freedom and priority to exercise before returning to one's routine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope people get an opportunity to look at your models, which are phenomenal. And it's like such a careful attention to detail that then operates at the level of material, of site. And I was real fortunate enough to see it at the jury, so I've also been able to see it come even in the last few weeks. So massive congratulations.
Hello, I'm Charlotte, and my project is an analysis of material flows and focuses on the circular transition of the built environment. I'm in Diploma 18, was in Diploma 18, for a second year, continuing my research from fourth year, where my focus was to facilitate reuse by introducing a new actor who orchestrates the entire reuse process. This year, I'm providing actors with the knowledge and tools to make small adjustments with big impact on reclamation and reuse rates. Over the last 2 years, I engaged with stakeholders across the entire structural steel industry. I went on 13 site visits, conducted 22 interviews, and attended numerous webinars and conferences. This field research encouraged me to realize reuse with 3 different projects: the Material Arcade, the Little Toilet, and the reuse of structural steel. I'm running the Material Arcade and its material library in 38 Bedford Square that I hope you all now know. Since the beginning of term 2, we circulated 315 kilograms of materials in the AA, which is equivalent to a carbon footprint of 565 kilograms CO2e. We encourage other students to design for deconstruction. Screw, never glue. The Little Toilet was born out of the desperate need for a toilet in 38 Bedford Square. I wanted to try to introduce reuse to a project and to a real-life salvage operation right here at the AA. In term 1, DIP 18 collaborated with David Chipperfield's LSE, Lincoln's Inn Fields Deep Refurbishment, creating a collection of material data sheets for material reuse. Thanks to Deconstruct UK, I was able to actually salvage the sink and toilet from my data sheet. However, due to the small size of the space under the stairs in 38, they ended up not being used. But AA facilities were able to use tiles my colleague Monzi salvaged from the same site after I gave them a deep clean, removing all the grout. My efforts then inspired Leszek to find an old mirror and some surplus splashboards to complete the bathroom with more salvaged elements. The key takeaways and learnings from those 2 projects are the necessity to introduce reuse aspirations early on, the importance of collaboration and communication, as well as the struggle to recognize an institutional need for reuse. A lot of stamina is necessary for successful reuse. My research on steel shows how similar bottlenecks and challenges could be addressed. My steel reuse interest was sparked at a site visit of Tower Bridge Court in October 2022, where steel from the 1930s is being reused. Since, I've visited and interviewed several projects and stakeholders pioneering steel reuse here in the UK and produced a guidebook, which addresses the identified challenges with a specific focus on the deconstruction, fabrication, and design of reclaimed steel. I've also given continuous personal development talks at architecture and engineering firms to destigmatize and reduce knowledge gaps, further ones are lined up for the summer, including one at Foster's. Before diving into my steel research, a few terms need to be explained. BOF stands for Basic Oxygen Furnace and is the primary steel production route. EAF is the electric arc furnace where steel recycling happens. I was able to visit Celsa Steel's EAF in Wales a year ago, where steel is made from up to 97% scrap. The steel recycling process is less carbon intensive than the BOF, but still emits close to a ton of CO2 per ton of steel produced. Reuse emissions are mostly from the defabrication, equaling to only around 2.5% of that of the virgin steel production. Steel with the lowest emission currently sits at 330 kilos, but we are decades away from reducing EAF emissions even remotely close to that right here in the UK. Currently, steel is one of the very few materials that is cheaper when reused. The cost of reclaimed sections sits around 20% lower than that of new steel. The main contributor to the cost of reused steel is the testing. Due to the rising energy cost and global conflicts, the cost of new steel has been rising independently from scrap steel since 2021, making this economical case for reuse. The BOFs of British Steel and Tata Steel make up 81% of the UK steel production. The remaining 19% are smaller steel recyclers, such as Celsa and Liberty Steel. Since the peak of UK steel production in the 1970s, there's been a gradual decline. The UK's 2 biggest steel producers are due to shut down their BOFs to transition to steel recycling plants. This move is predicted to reduce steel production in the UK by a further 75% until the new recycling furnaces open up. This has been widely covered by the media as over 4,000 job cuts are expected, and the government pledged to invest £1.2 billion. The non-British owned Tata Steel and British Steel are predicted to benefit from this move by covering the UK steel demand with imports from their BOFs elsewhere. So, what can we do to improve the UK steel sector? I believe that we cannot simply disregard the existing linear production lines. Instead, we need to maintain them alongside the new circular systems of reuse and closed-loop recycling until we can meet the entire demand without relying on imports to ensure a successful circular transition. Right now, steel reuse is economically feasible, but I forecast an even bigger price gap of 35% in the future. Steel is inherently reusable material, as you can see on the example of the 1930 steel from House of Fraser being reused at Tower Bridge Court. The steel's durability, strength, and ease of testing mechanical and chemical compositions allows for the safe reuse. As a conclusion to the Progress Steel Reuse Research Project in 2019, the Steel Construction Institute published a protocol for testing and certifying reclaimed steelworks. Last year, they published additional testing guidelines for the reuse of steel that does not comply with the modern design standards introduced after 1970. The testing facilities just require a so-called dog bone sample from each batch, and these can easily be sent by mail. The standard practice for demolition is to cut the structure into easy-to-handle 1.5 meter lengths with a blowtorch and selling these on as steel scrap. While almost all structural steel is recovered, only 13% are reused, most of which are the in-situ reuse of structures. This statistic is from a research paper on the real and perceived barriers to steel reuse from 2017 highlights the knowledge fragmentation and stigma that reuse is expensive and difficult. However, even though in almost 60% of the projects with steel reuse, it has been less costly or indifferent. I've built an extensive network in the steel reuse sector and have connected different actors to each other in an attempt to reduce the industry fragmentation. Here are a few examples of the encountered challenges. Simon from Cleveland Steel and Tubes shared his concern of slow turnover rates, which is a direct result of the reduced section sizes reclaimed in common demolition practices. Matteo emphasizes the need for a larger stock, and Sam Ainscough struggles with the CE marking of reclaimed steel of unknown origin. Narcis Giralt from Celsa Spain, who currently takes part in another EU-wide steel reuse project, has difficulty getting their insurer to give warranty for the reclaimed steel. An anonymous engineer, however, does not understand this issue, saying taking the risk and taking warranty for reclaimed steel is not much of a risk when following the Steel Construction Institute testing protocols. As we are in the beginnings of a transition towards a circular economy, learning to work with the existing methods will speed up adaptation to reclaim rather than to scrap steel sections. The common cutting method for deconstructing steel beams results in 70% usability of the original sections, meaning the stock of reclaimed steel consists of shorter than standard sections. The already tested and approved intermesh steel connection was introduced in 2020. Its interlocking connection allows for a direct load transfer between both web and flange of the beams, compared to the usual load transfer through bolt and welds, making it significantly stronger. In comparison to the spliced, welded, and bolted connection to extend beams, the ISC is simpler and quicker to install on site. It reduces the need for highly skilled workers by automation of the fabrication process. It can also utilize the diagonal we see in the business-as-usual steel deconstruction. More about this is found in the Design with Reclaimed Steel chapter of my TS project. Lastly, I'm in the process of attempting a real-life steel reuse intervention, promoting the existing stock of reclaimed steel. For this, I reached out to architects asking for potential steel reuse projects in which I could intervene before the steel tender stage. Again, David Chipperfield Architects were happy to share the necessary information of the LSE deep refurbishment in return for steel reuse recommendations once my analysis is complete. So, hello, I'm Charlotte, the steel circulator. Thank you so much for having me here today at Chipperfield. I'm excited to present the reuse potential of your LSE refurbishment. A big thank you to AKT2 for joining as well. At Cleveland Steel alone, over 1,300 reclaimed standard-sized beam sections are currently in stock, only waiting to be reused. With the help of Hainer Tillett Steel's stock matcher tool, I was able to assign some of those reclaimed steel beams to design sections of your LSE refurbishment. Just over 50% of the beams could potentially be replaced with reclaimed ones, pending further investigation and approval by engineers, of course. The carbon savings by replacing parts of the structure with reclaimed materials are substantial, equal to the carbon sequestered by around 6,500 trees in a year. And this reuse could be as prominent as you'd like. The fire coating allows for the beams to look exactly like new ones. Alternatively, you can highlight the reuse by using a pigment to color the reclaimed steel. However, I propose that you incorporate the intermesh steel connection to extend the reclaimed sections to fit your structure proposal. That way, the reuse of steel includes the design for deconstruction and utilizes the large stock of shorter section lengths for more efficient reuse. I expect a 25% increase when utilizing the stock of shorter sections, with potentially over 100 tons of steel to come from reclamation yards. This can be as visible as you like, hiding or celebrating the reuse of steel beams. Not only will the steel reuse have a significant impact on the embodied carbon of your project, but it will also come with decreased material cost. Over £20,000 can be reallocated elsewhere. If you mention the steel circulator connected you when purchasing this reclaimed steel, you might even get a discount. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Charlotte, you've already moved on, so, I like your split personality very much. I think you and Hiro should go into business together. I think that would be profitable to both of you and potentially very interesting. I really look forward to seeing where it goes. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Ray from Deep 19, and my project explores early life in rural China, synchronizing the ancestral hall with housing, since the space has already been misused, and it is now mainly used for informal social activities, especially by the elderly. So my project will push it further and explore more possibilities. Nowadays, 20% of China's population is elderly, more than half being empty nesters. And the departure of the young generation leaves the elderly mentally isolated, and the body generation make the daily task quite challenging for them. And in this way, the mutual aid spontaneously emerged, like the elderly association, health cards, shared kitchens. All these events take place in the ancestral hall. And the ancestral hall is a place for the ancestor worship, because the traditional village is based on the blood ties, sharing the same ancestors. The tablet and drawings of the ancestors are placed in the hall. After death, people's name will be inscribed on the panel, and the people will become part of the ancestor, bless others, and it's also a way to commemorate those who has been passed away. The ancestral hall has been evolved from the ancestor veneration to the community education, and now it has been appropriated by the elderly as a living room. It has gone through 3 stages: the ancestors, past ideologies, family type, and the dead space. Because for the ancient time, we have the culture of the filial piety, means respect of the elderly, and the village was based on the lineage. We can see the structures, and also the house. The village is based on is mirror the hierarchy of the structures. As we can see, the ancestral halls, the central part for tablet, and the patios hold different events, and it's doubled as the meeting room or the court. And during this time, because the filial piety promote the multi-generation living, the elderly they live with the young generation, and the ancestral hall is, because in China we have a thing like, too fast. serving the dead as serving the living. And the second stage is the dead ideology, because the social structure has been changed. Now it's for the community education, for the grandpa mode generation, and because the collective living make the elderly and the young generation separate living, and the ancestral hall that be using as a space for working and also for people living, and the hierarchy has been resolved and the space has been misused in this time. And the last stage is the dead space, because the young generation is leaving, the family structure is dissolved, so the elderly, they have becoming an elderly social association. The ancestral has been used as an elderly center. They playing games, mahjong, and do some exercise. And during this time, the young generation is leaving, so the space is only used by the elderly. The gray space is unused space. And the ancestral hall is the living room in this time. So in conclusion, the ancestral hall retain its sacred and symbolic significance, and it being utilizing as a frame in unforeseen ways. Living with the dead means the dead people, the ancestors, the past ideologies, dissolved family structures, and the unused space. The site is situated in Shixia, Guangzhou, near the case study, and we'll start with one ancestral hall as a test site. I will explain the design through one character, Grandma Ray, in her 70s, who lives alone in the village. And her daughter and son's family return for a few days each year, leaving the space available for other use. And the patios, once the shared space, now is divided and occupied by different families for logistic functions. And currently, Ray spends most of her time in ancestral hall for mental and physical support. And to enhance this mutual aid, the project introduced a flexible house system with a communal space. And for the renovation of the house, it's renovate the house into the ancestral hall. Because in the ancient time, the jian was a fundamentally modular unit, the space between the two columns. The project will restore the space to jian, and to leave the space for the gate, and introduce a door system. The door define the boundary of the families. If the space extend, this cat will own 2 rooms, and it means Ray have the options to live alone or live with others. The family structure is dynamic. And for the patios, the new gate is ended, retaining the familiar social spatials and element, the private space but public access. The columns will help to establish the spatial orders, and the patios make the space more adaptable. For the village, I'm trying to implement the same principles to the village, and start a clear outline to ensure the privacy, foster a sense of ownership and belongings. And then blurred boundaries allows for expansions, make the space more adaptable. And the spatial hierarchies define the unused space, unchangeable space, and no function zones. The patios can be combined with different functions like shared kitchens, bathroom, or the.
从去年开始，我加入了村子的改造计划。之前，我独自守着这个空房子。改造后，我的生活多了更多的可能性。人们拆除了部分现有的墙体，加固了结构，安装了新门和厕所。现在我住在这个房间，其他的房间出租给了一对有孩子的夫妻。白天他们外出务工，我帮忙照看孩子。平时他们很照顾我，洗澡一直是个大问题，对我和朋友们都是。 新建的公共浴室让我们可以相互帮助。新的设计保留了原有的门口社交空间，让人们可以待得更久。以前我大部分时间都在祠堂，每天11点我去帮忙准备午饭。我们有一个共享厨房，大家轮班做饭。如果不是我轮班，我就去打乒乓球。乒乓球桌也可以用作餐桌。下午我待在祠堂，下棋、看电视、聊天。老周会帮我在祠堂门口的树下剪头发。改造后，村子有了更多的公共场地。每天泡泡脚，我的腿也不那么痛了。天井的餐厅是多功能的，可以用来打麻将或者编竹篮。共享厨房旁边有个小菜园，我种了点我最喜欢的小辣椒。现在整个村子仿佛变成了一个大祠堂。新建的祠堂通过仪式和空间，把所有人都联系起来。供奉祭品的中厅，平时被老罗当成木工工作室。有时候我会跟着大家打打太极。各种活动和节日仪式也在天井举办。新旧居民之间的矛盾不可避免的，比如瑞刚睡下，就听到新来的小李大展歌喉。我像使用祠堂一样使用村子，熟悉的空间和更多未知的可能性。
The design began with the tablet, the outer shelf combined with the staircase to enhance the spatial orders for the tablet, for the dad, and also for the living, for the daily life, for the entertainment. And the patios ensure the flexibilities. It can be extended to the communities. In the end, the village will be transformed into a shared space with a communal ownership. And the ancestral hall, once a powerful symbol of a specific practice, now opened up for possibilities for the different use. It's original for the house and for the based on the filial piety, means respect the elderly, but now it's back to the family, back to the elderly. It's not only a space for the dead, but also a space for the living to experiment. That's it. Thank you.
I have to tell you how excited your panel were. I mean, they're like the most passionate advocacy for this project and describing every subtle move that you made in order to create this community, like the kind of anthropological work that you put behind it, the whole blurring of sacred and everyday, and just the level of sophistication that is hidden in all of these very, very careful moves that are designed down to the last handrail. And it's beautiful work. Thank you.
So I'm Tommaso from D20. My project is Gente del Po. The Po Delta is a territory which governing powers appropriated, controlled, and transformed through history. The people of the Po live in a fluid territory where state infrastructure is becoming obsolete and the land floods. This unstable condition creates a premise to resist the consequences of these politics, introducing care as the base for a network of commons. The research stems from my interest in the degrees of freedom in space, relating to institutional architecture, regulations within society, and the gaps within these to appropriate space. I look into the pedagogy of education through participation, relinquishing the hermetically isolating space of the school institution as a practice of emancipation. Leading to the metaphysical landscape of the Delta, opening a dialogue between architecture of control, its failure, and identifying devices and tools to escape it. The research focuses on the Italian Po Delta, the final chapter of the river's voyage through the country's most industrial region. Here, I witnessed vast flatlands of fields and canals sitting below sea level, an engineered and highly controlled landscape unnervingly sitting behind tall embankments. The delta today is scattered with architectural remnants of the politics of internal colonization of various governments across history to control and organize the territory and its communities. Institutional architecture for aristocratic and ecclesiastic control and production sit in contrast to the vernacular, forms of resistance and refuge for local communities. As highlighted in the model, infrastructures like drainage pumps and riverbanks expose the tense relationship between man and water. Embankments are the threshold between ways of understanding and inhabiting the territory. Oblivious to or embracing the instability of the landscape, as the vernacular does with infrastructures like the bilancione, a non-intensive fishing platform operating through a method of co-ownership, and the cavana, epicenter of the mussel breeding industry of the delta, sitting on pilotis along the water edge. The research explores in particular two historical moments which have determined the current configuration of the territory. The first is the Venetian Republic's diversion of Italy's largest river for political and economic purposes, causing conflicts of ownership and calling for definition of state borders on lands and lagoon as between the Venetian and Papal states. The diversion triggers rapid sedimentation, leading to a process of mapping and allocation of lands to delegated Venetian families. Delta villas are the organizing element of the Republic's territorial expansion, through which noble families established legal, political, and economic frameworks, exercising feudal power and diversifying the economy, retreating to mainland due to Venice's fading maritime trading routes. Is it going? Oh, yeah. The villa's influence transforms the floodland into a productive landscape. Embankments define the water edge, locks drain and irrigate the territory, lands are ripped from water and converted for agriculture. They become a reference point for settlements to develop, displaying the violence of institutional power on the territory and its population. The second key historical moment can be identified after the Second World War. In the 50s, Christian Democrats carry out politics of ruralization and internal colonization similar to those of their predecessors, although disguised as a form of welfare. Land reform occurs through remediation of lagoons, expropriation of large estates, and introduction of small farming property. The imposition of the rational farmhouse violently transforms the typical lagoon environment. The farm is the territorial infrastructure operating as a point system, disseminating the population along huge distances to avoid upheavals. It relies on the patriarchal family as the machine for preservation and functioning of the system. The population is instrumentalized to contribute to the transformation of the territory, digging channels to drain and irrigate, and building embankments to fixate the water edge, morphing the territory, its relations and use. The violent morphological transformation of the landscape wanted by governing powers continues today. Modes of production clash, the agrarian economy collides with the long-existing economy of fishing valleys and common ownership of local natural resources. Excessive fragmentation of land jeopardizes the agrarian system, resulting in partial abandonment of the territory and selling lands to corporations. Methane water extraction by state-owned companies and the tendency of the territory to flood causes the delta to sink beneath water level repeatedly, complicating the enduring conflict with nature. The man-made territory falls victim of itself and the system fails, exposing the fragility of the enterprise territory and its population. Considering the history of control and imposition of power into the landscape, where the population is merely considered for its utility for production and transformation of the landscape, how can the territory and communities coalesce to resist and establish their autonomy? From a territory saturated by institutional and economic control, manifesting an understanding of the territory projected towards extraction and environmental violence through instrumentalization of populations, to a vernacular understanding visible in typologies which operate within the gaps of this highly controlled space, sitting on riverbanks and lagoon landscapes, forms of resistance of local communities inhabiting this territory. We can learn from fishing infrastructure, historically acting as an outpost, a retreat from government control, and area for commons to create. The project can act as infrastructures operating along the embankments, learning from devices deployed on the riverbanks, where locals have reacted to the fragile landscape. Reappropriating the territory when interior becomes exterior, and exterior becomes interior. When flooding erases the frameworks of the landscape, the riverbank is the only emerged land, a platform of emancipation, of resistance, where a new collective world can be imagined. The delta today finds itself in a post-human scale where machines, protocols of control, and sensors reign. The inhospitality of nature, which made this territory an outpost, a refuge for outlaws and outcasts through history, recalls the inhospitality of the enterprise territory we are left with today, which can once again become an outpost for the collectivity to hide in plain sight within the clogs of the machine. The project questions how to care for a decaying land and its population. It rejects the idea that the delta can be saved or reverted to a former state. Instead, it draws attention to the fragility of the landscape and its population, identifiable in the layers of the embankment. It is the only land free from economic exploitation, providing a fundamental space of liberty, reconnecting the inhabitants to their river. An opportunity to reintroduce forms of use across the territory which aren't solely driven by efficiency of production. The project finds in this landscape an opportunity to construct spaces and relationships that can materially and symbolically reconfigure the common territory. The embankment becomes a space of freedom, a refuge from what is formalized and contained within rigid behavioral rules. It learns from vernacular co-ownership to define a system of relations, a network between different communities and age groups. Platforms and structures balance on the embankment, celebrating the threshold, creating a relationship and experience of the territory by merging river and land. They provide access to this terrain vague to become a condenser, a ritualistic space which can coagulate forms of resistance. Architecture is understood as a tool to stimulate a sense of stewardship through observation, measurement, and participation. The proposal devises a family of elements as a framework and backdrop for the appropriation of the riverbank, providing a core to hypothesize scenarios of use of the embankment. The scaffold-like system provides flexibility and adaptability. It can be enriched by people's intervention through functional and symbolic elements. Structures are thought to grow, morphing into objects of different scales based on their context, needs, and likes. The abstract system acquires recognizable form, from abstraction to architecture, from system to family, moving between the tension of the two polarities of the project. On one side, open to multiple configurations, on the other, influenced by the measures of the embankment and shaped by a collective memory, establishing the shared cultural value of the project. Organization and construction are thought to be independently managed by local communities. Therefore, the project provides them with a manual, offering basic construction knowledge and ideas for potential customizations, in the attempt of interpreting the role of the architect as a mediator. The project is thought as an extension node of the Arci Clubs, the largest Italian non-profit recreational and cultural association. Establishment of these clubs is financed by membership fees, donations, and grants provided by ethical banks and microcredit companies. The proposal relies on these grants, along with grants by the municipality, to build along portions of the embankment, creating points of density and aggregation. Hubs and spaces where collective activities and rituals, along with more intimate scenarios, unfold. Scenes from daily life, a group of friends gathering, a father and a son fishing on a summer afternoon. Collectivities are brought together orbiting a bridge, providing access to and exposing the height of the threshold between land and water, uniting forces around recognizable elements. Creating spaces of resistance, centers for care and mutual solidarity in moments where water attempts to regain its lost ground. The vertical landmark, a light tower, becomes a space for observation and visibility, to locate the presence of the hubs in the landscape. Storage pavilions are devised as archives and theaters, backdrops of activities which unfold along the section and in proximity of the embankment, bringing life to it. The structures create a space for intergenerational exchange, coming together on the embankment through cultural activities, but also local traditional events such as Sunday gatherings, feasts, debates, spaces where the elder, youth, and collectivities can gather at a dining table, where children run in the grass and play at the end of a long Sunday lunch. The embankment becomes a space for spontaneity. It becomes a space for yearly and monthly celebrations and festivities, where the community gathers on the embankment, along with more impromptu events and activities, watching a movie, a play, and dancing to the concert of a local band. Allotments and a rainwater collection tank are provided for sustainment, countering the extractive culture of the territory. However, elements aren't strictly functional, but rather construct a language that is recognizable within the landscape, constructing a common identity. More remote contexts host more independent and smaller isolated landmarks. More extemporaneous objects which can be appropriated as bivouacs and shelters, influencing smaller portions of the embankment. The object and shading construct a space where more intimate and spontaneous rituals happen during daytime, a couple playing the guitar or a shepherd grazing, resting in the shade. At nighttime, lighting activates the embankment, providing a space of autonomy, of anarchy for the youth to hide from the provincial gaze, and establish its unique, intimate relationship with the landscape. The project doesn't want to act as a master plan, but rather operates at intervals, punctuating the embankments, the thread connecting these collective spaces together, establishing a network of care and observation for the fragile landscape and its population scattered across a vast territory as an act of resistance and emancipation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just 2 words to wrap up you and then just say a couple of things about everyone. I think there's a fantastic range of work culminating in something I think one of our panel described as filmic. And I think the bringing of something that is immediate and tangible and humane and lived into this deep and quite sophisticated understanding of context actually is something that sort of unites all of these 11 projects. I know there's a lot of projects. You've been super patient. It's a wonderful way of celebrating. Sometimes it's hard to celebrate actively because there's such serious topics here. But I think, again, what unites all of you is, again, this kind of cultural, economic, political, theoretical context that sits deep into the projects while they all come forward with something highly tangible, something that feels very real, even if that is, again, highly theoretical, down to the very material. And the scope is really extraordinary. I mean, I think that that really goes far and beyond what one would expect to see in any school of architecture. And I think all of these projects have a life beyond the school, and I really look forward to seeing what they are. So thank you so much. Go and get a drink. You deserve it.
Thank you.